half a century since you joined the Indian Foreign Service. It also coincides with the last time South Asia's national boundaries were changed and new sovereignties established. Essentially, Bangladesh was created in 1971, 1972. In this short arc of history, but probably a very long arc for most of us present here, considering the age of the people here, how have you seen South Asia evolve? What has really changed in South Asia, and what has remained constant during this period?
Thank you, Sushant, for reminding me of my age. I suppose that gives me the right to pontificate. But for me, when I look back over, let's say, 50 years or even 75 years since independence, it seems to me that in South Asia, the arc of history is still bending towards light. And if you think of it, we are in this paradoxical situation where more, let's say, Indians, Bangladeshis, even Sri Lankans, despite the headlines, live longer, healthier, more prosperous lives than they ever have in history, a higher proportion, let's say. But the problem, the paradox is that inequality is growing, both within states and between states in South Asia. I mean, there are other countries which are not doing as well. And if you look at Afghanistan, Pakistan, Myanmar, I don't think you can make the same statement with the same confidence that a higher proportion of the population is living longer, healthier, more prosperous lives. So it's a very mixed picture. State building, nation building is still a work in progress across much of South Asia. And a lot of our political problems, I think, come from that. In economic terms, we seem to have learned the lessons, and we did go through a period. Bangladesh certainly has learned lessons from the past, policy lessons. India went through high growth years in the first decade of this century. But some of us seem to be at risk of forgetting those lessons again, and of repeating old policies. And I think populist politics today, actually, across the board, and this is irrespective of the relative success in most of these societies, is actually leading to polarization internal. And you can see some countries have still not arrived at a settled political and social contract internally. Some of us. Some are in the process of renegotiating, including India. And we're going through this churn, which I suppose Adam Tooze calls the polycrisis of South Asia, and I think it's a good phrase. It's really the right way to describe what we have. Because of that polycrisis, it's hard to tell where we will be going. But for me, the crisis is also an opportunity, because we should do what we did in 1991. We ended up in a terrible crisis, but we changed. And we did things that we found hard to do in normal times. We know what we need to do. It's not that we don't know. There's enough bright minds in South Asia. But the question is, can we bring ourselves to do it? Because this crisis that we have is really quite bad. If you look at it, 5 governments have changed in South Asia in the last year and a half. Not all of them willingly, not all of them constitutionally. 3 are already in advanced stages of talks with the IMF on debt relief and adjustment policies, and more may follow. And as I said, we're renegotiating our own social and political contracts internally. So it really is a moment both of danger, but certainly of opportunity. And this, for me, is important, that we actually identify this time as a time when we can change things for the better.
But let me come to something more something more real, which agitates everyone's mind. The country, the big country to India's north, which seems to be raised every time India is challenged or India seems to be in some kind of trouble in the region. Of course, I'm talking about China, which casts a big shadow on South Asia. So when did Beijing actually start evincing deep interest in the region? That is outside of Pakistan. Of course, with Pakistan, it had historical ties. And how have that contours of that interest changed? Because essentially at one point in time, it seemed like that they were only going to do economy and trade. And now we see in Nepal and Sri Lanka that they've been deeply involved in domestic politics, choosing winners, choosing losers, asking parties to go go together, come together, the communists in Nepal particularly. So what is Beijing's long-term plan here? Or is it just that they are crossing the river by feeling the stones still?
Well, I think China's always been interested in South Asia because I think she sees three critical parts of her periphery that she needs to keep free of hostile foreign influences from where threats to China cannot develop. One, of course, Korean Peninsula, the other Indochina, but South Asia also. But she's been flexible, and if you look at the Sri Lanka Rice Rubber Pact, for instance, you look at what she was doing with Pakistan in the 50s, you look at what she did with India and the investment she put into the relationships that she had across South Asia right from the 50s. So this feigned indifference that, oh, it doesn't matter and we don't care, that I don't believe. That I actually think that for China this has always mattered. But she's been very flexible in the means. Right at the beginning, she thought India's non-alignment served her purposes of keeping outside influences, hostile influences, keeping the US out of South Asia at that time. And over time, then she relied on Pakistan. When relations with India deteriorated, conflict, she relied on Pakistan, used Pakistan to keep India tied down in the subcontinent. But over time, her interests have grown, as she has grown. And now South Asia represents a whole host of things. And Pakistan's utility certainly has gone up. Gwadar as a port at the top of the Arabian Sea, near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, where her energy comes from. Pakistan's influence in Afghanistan, which she's tried to leverage. Her interest in Afghanistan's raw materials. Pakistan's role among the Muslim countries. But more than that, Sri Lanka's position, strategic as it is, astride the Indian Ocean sea lanes, which bring her energy and take her trade across the world. Myanmar as her other way of avoiding the Malacca dilemma that she faces. Beside, in fact, these are the two. So it's not that South Asia doesn't matter. If anything, its importance is increased. Xi Jinping therefore announced the CPEC, $62 billion actually to Pakistan in 2015. And if you add up what they've committed to South Asian countries, not counting Myanmar, it's under BRI and various things, adds up to over $100 billion. And that's a sizable commitment. But does she have a plan? No plan survives first contact. One. Two, I don't think so. If you look across this period, she's been pretty opportunistic in the means she's used, in who she's worked with. It really depends on her larger calculus. I don't think her basic idea of keeping the periphery free and making sure there's no threats, that changes. But Nepal has always been important because of Tibet, for instance. I don't think that changes, but the means she's used, she's very flexible. Today, I think actually China's own trajectory is in doubt. And I actually think they're entering a pretty fundamental readjustment in their own, both political and economic processes, certainly. And this happened to all the miracle economies, by the way. After 30, 40 years of a growth spurt, each of them went through a huge readjustment, first economically, and in each case it was more painful than they anticipated. But they were also accompanied by a renegotiation of the social and political contract. I mean, democracy came to South Korea, to Taiwan as part of that readjustment. And there is, I think, a case to be made. It's possible that China's entering a similar period after 40 years of a fantastic growth spurt on a scale that nobody's ever done before. But if you look at the pattern, I mean, it seems to me that you have to be prepared for that. So for me, there are big question marks today about China's own trajectory, but I don't see that basic interest in South Asia changing. It's just that the means available to her might shift. And let's see where that develops. But I don't see some mother brain at work with a long-term plan, with great foresight. You know, the wonder about China is, for me, that they can make such big mistakes and such huge successes all at the same time. The variation is so extreme. You look at BRI, you look at one-child policy, you look at Great Leap Forward. You know, these are not small mistakes. I mean, these are huge. But let's see where it goes. So, sorry to add to your worries.
Yeah. You spoke of Adam Tooze's characterization of polycrisis of South Asia, but as the biggest country in South Asia and also the intermediary between all the other countries in South Asia, more or less so, India lies at the center of this polycrisis in some ways. What does this mean for India as a country, as a society, as a polity? And as you said, this crisis is an opportunity, but how challenging is it going to be India for it to overcome this crisis?
Well, if you look at it, it depends on how you approach this mentally. We're part of a bigger crisis in the world. I mean, look at how well South Pacific is doing out of China-US contention. I mean, so for me, there's a moment of geopolitical opportunity, but the South Asian polycrisis actually gives us a chance to rework our relationships and to actually double down on what we should be doing but haven't been doing, which is opening up our economies to each other, which is building connectivity links among ourselves, but more important, making sure that we deal with the collective security interests of our sub-region, which are so important if we are to grow and develop and deal with the poverty, etc., that should be our priority. But you need to do it. We've done this in our relationship with Bangladesh over the last decade and a half. We sorted out the security issues and then started building the rest of it. And I think that's doable. You know, we were very nervous because these were new states, nation building. When SARC started, it started by saying we won't touch the politics, we won't look at security, we'll only do social and economic. That was reassuring to people because it didn't threaten their identity and so on. But today I think you're at a completely different stage. After 75 years, you know, we're no longer, we shouldn't be treating ourselves as children or adolescents. I mean, we need to get out there and deal with each other in a mature fashion. And for me, that's what the opportunity is here. And for India, it means also working to make sure that India is seen as a factor of stability by our neighbors. You know, we are now a long way from 2005, when all the political parties in Nepal came to India and were ready to trust India's good offices to arrive at an agreement among themselves on Nepal's arrangements, constitutional arrangements. I mean, think how different that is from where we are today after this 2015 blockade, which might have been informal, we might claim that the government of India had nothing to do with it, but every Nepalese is scarred by that experience. And so we need to do a little work also in how we project ourselves and how, but for me it's not the projection, the narrative, the spin that matters. It's what we actually do in the neighborhood. That's what neighbors understand and that's what neighbors respond to.
But why has India not been able to do that in the neighborhood so far, particularly in respect of trade and economy? And you spoke of SARC. SARC really is moribund or at least failed. SARC doesn't seem to be working out. And there are fears that if the next SARC summit is held, everyone else will vote for China to be included as a full member, and therefore our SARC summit is something which is not in which is not in India's interest.
No, SARC has structural limitations because of the way it was constituted and the time when it was. And maybe SARC's time is done. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing the right thing among yourselves. Work with whoever's willing to work with you. I mean, simple example, set up payment arrangements in rupees, like you have with some people today. Offer it to everyone. I dare say that Pakistan will not join, but that's their choice. But offer it to everyone in South Asia. At a time when everybody is facing a debt crisis, has problems meeting their debts and paying their bills. So, I mean, there are solutions, and I think there's enough creativity in the region that we can do things like that. Why have we not done it? I think it's a failure of imagination, primarily. And let's face it, we are so conscious of being big, of being large. I think there's an example in Ranjit Ray's book, I think, where he was asked by a prime minister, why do the Nepalese not like us? We've done so much for them. But that's exactly why they don't like you, because you're giving, and you use words like elder brother. I mean, how would you feel if I told you that we Dravidians, you know, we were here first, so, you know, we are your elder brother. I mean, this is I mean, every time we mean it well. You know, we tell Nepalese, "Arey, aap to bilkul hamare jaise hain, you're just like us." What have we done? We've just wiped out his identity, her identity, his identity, whatever. We mean it well. I mean, it's done out of the goodness of our heart, out of fraternal feeling. But, you know, and these are things we're not sensitive to, strangely enough. We're not sensitive among ourselves because we have a very high tolerance level for multiple identities and plurality. But we expect other people to do. But you can't expect that from countries which are still in the process of building nationalism and nationhood. And state building, certainly, is still a problem. So there's a whole host of things we need to do. You know, I do think that this is the time to do it.
So two questions. The question about what Ranjit Ray heard from Prime Minister Modi and what people say, and this is something which I would hear from friends when you serve in the United Nations or in multinational organizations, that why are you treating us like this, or why are you considering us like this? But this leads me to the question, what is the right way of looking at countries like Nepal or Bangladesh or even Bhutan for that matter, which would not offend their sensibilities and still would work to India's interests?
You know, it's interesting. For many years, in the 50s, 60s, we used this liberal vocabulary, right? Democracy, goodwill, we're doing it out of the goodness of our hearts, etc., to justify pretty realist behavior in our neighborhood. We intervened, we interfered, whether it was, you know, Tribhuvan going back to Nepal, across the board. I mean, so our behavior was realist, and our vocabulary was liberal and moral, and everybody sees through this. But over time, we've gone to the other extreme. Today, our vocabulary is realist. Our behavior is still much the same. And a lot of it actually very well motivated. But we present ourselves as 100% realist, when we're not. Because if we were realist, we would actually accommodate their interests, and we'd be dealing with them on the basis of interest. It's legitimate to deal with each other on the basis of interest because we have common interests in South Asia. So I don't see a problem with that. But they can see through it when you lie, or when you spin, or when you tell a story or try a narrative. And that actually reduces your credibility and your effectiveness. And so I think what we need to do actually, and when I say our interest, that includes the interest of whichever is the border state, the people of the border state. Maybe not the CM necessarily, but the people and the others. And we need to actually integrate that into the way we deal with our neighbors. And then they understand you. They have, in my experience at least, when you talk straight to your neighbors about your interests and theirs, and when you do what a normal diplomat should be doing, which is thinking of your interest and his, and making sure that he leaves the table with something too. Because otherwise, why would he implement what he agrees with you? So you need to craft things which work for both sides. And if you did that, and do it straightforward, I think you can regain a level of credibility and actually get your work done, because you have a common interest here to build on. And that I'm convinced of. There are things today which the rest of the world is not dealing with, the transnational issues that really matter. Developing country debt crisis. I mean, the IMF says 53 countries are at grave risk today. Climate change, look at Nepal, Pakistan's floods. You know, you think of pandemics, I mean, COVID. Where was the world? Where was the rest of the international system? Now's the time for you in South Asia to do something, whatever you can, within your ability, for things like this. And if you did that, came up with ideas, and you'd have to implement it together. You can't do this alone. Talk to your neighbors, honestly, saying these are our problems, you have a problem, we have a problem too, and dealt with it. Then I think you could actually make real progress. But you can't count on the world anymore. So it's all the more reason to actually work within the subcontinent.
The other thing that you spoke of, saying that rather than try and look with, through institutions like SAARC or look at whole of South Asia, you could work with countries which are interested in working, which are receptive to India's entreaties or approaches in a certain way. But does this not lead to a question that does South Asia or Indian subcontinent really exist? I understand Indian subcontinent exists as a geographical entity, as a geopolitical entity, but does South Asia really exist? should Afghanistan and Pakistan not be seen more as part of West Asia and Bangladesh as part of East Asian tigers than being part of South Asia?
You know, you're right. It's an artificial term. It was created by American social science. And I like subcontinent, actually, because it's a geographical fact. But we're the only subcontinent in the world, by the way. And it also reminds you that we might be part of Asia, a subcontinent, but we're also different. But we're linked while we have a certain distinct identity. And where do you draw the boundaries of the subcontinent to the east and the west? I mean, geographically, there is no boundary, actually. There's no natural boundary to this, to the subcontinent. And so I prefer that, or Southern Asia, because again, it suggests a larger swathe of territory. But the main reason I think we use these terms is because, you know, whether it's Afghanistan or what happens in Myanmar, this affects us directly. I mean, you saw the Chin coming across the border into Mizoram. What happens in Afghanistan, you've seen how many of the Pakistani terrorists that we had to deal with were trained in Afghanistan, how they'd subcontracted or outsourced this work, the ISI had outsourced this to their friends in Afghanistan. So this affects us. It's part of South Asia's security. You can't think of South Asian security or prosperity and exclude these places. So whatever the cultural affinities and whatever else they might, and Pakistan, there have been periods when I think Pakistan was very tempted to say they had only a West Asian identity. But, you know, they keep getting dragged back here into South Asia. And the same is true of Myanmar. So I'm less worried about the definitions than about clarity in how we deal with the outcomes and the interests. I mean, these are real things. But you're right. I mean, Confucius, I think, was asked, what would you do if you were ever given a state to run? Nobody ever trusted him, by the way, in his lifetime. They gave him, and what was the first thing you would do? And his answer was, I would rectify the names. Because if you don't call things by the right name, you think wrong, and then, you know, actions lead to the wrong results, et cetera, which is fairly logical. It's not something we do very often. We just swallowed South Asia whole with a capital S. At least make it a small s.
Renaming reminds me of, probably that's why China wants to rename everything, whether in Arunachal Pradesh or elsewhere. But the question which bothers a lot of people in India particularly now is India's domestic politics, which seems to be getting more and more intertwined with its politics in South Asia. Not that it was not earlier there. You know, Bangladesh and West Bengal, Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu, UP and Bihar and Nepal, they were always connected. But what we have seen at the federal level, at the central level, especially statements like termites, Mr. Modi must be the only prime minister who's visited Bangladesh and seen riots. I don't remember any Indian prime minister going to Bangladesh and seeing those kinds of riots. Or the demands made of Nepal to become a Hindu Rashtra, when the Nepalese people were clearly identifying it with the monarchy, rather than being a democratic republic. These kind of demands coming from the federal level, coming from the central level, which were extremely unusual earlier or very, very few earlier. What has been the effect of these kind of political policies on South Asia? And what are the consequences of pursuing this politics in Delhi that the region will have to bear?
I think the difference, of course, the interests of people in bordering states have always counted. And when we were responding to the Bangladesh crisis, one of the factors in Delhi's thinking was, you know, what about the risk of a greater Bengal, of sort of Bengali revanchism, as it were? And I mean, that's natural. It's legitimate, I think, to take those interests into account when you make policy in dealing with neighbors. And the neighbors understand that as well. In fact, they use it very often in their dealings with this big, overpowering Delhi. But I think what is different now, increasingly, is that party political interests enter into that calculus. And that they can see through very quickly. And when it becomes party political, or somebody's interest in a local election in some state or the other, then I think the neighbors will see, will actually react. And what they'll do, obviously, is they will react. And that's why you had the riots when Prime Minister Modi went to Dhaka, which the kind of thing that we've never faced before. And that's why I think it becomes difficult for us if we're busy trying to impose our own internal polarization and confusions on them, and it enters into our policy towards them, they will react. They will obviously react. That's why I say you need to be seen as a factor of stability, as a contributor to their security, to their prosperity. And you can't do that if you're busy playing party politics or election politics, not just at home, but even in your dealings with the neighbors. And that's where I think the source of the trouble is. I mean, termites, how can you call somebody termites and then expect them to be your friend? I mean, it's just impossible.
Coming to the other big player in the region, which is the United States, what is the role for the Indo-Pacific strategy which the United States makes for the region? Particularly because we saw so much happen in Nepal in recent months about being, are you going to be a part of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Nepalese parliament going and voting about it, and we have heard these similar kinds of voices in Sri Lanka. So what is going to be the role of the United States and its Indo-Pacific strategy in South Asia?
Well, I can't say what the US will do, nor can I say what that strategy really is, because we haven't heard a recent reiteration of it, at least not a comprehensive one recently. Given what, I mean, logically, when you look at it as an outsider, as I do, it can contribute to maritime security in the region, clearly. I mean, that's where the US strength is. US is no longer present on the Asian continent in continental terms, so I'm not really sure that Nepal in the Indo-Pacific strategy has a big role. Sri Lanka, I can see why. And with Hambantota there as well, it makes a big difference, and given her location. If we are heading in the other direction, walking away from RCEP, not getting into the trade leg of the IPEF, frankly, I'm not sure that the Indo-Pacific strategy is going to compensate for your lack of interest or activity and what you don't do. We should be doing things in our own interest first, rather than relying on somebody else's ill-defined strategy to do our work for us. And this is why I said we can't look at the rest of the world to answer our problems in South Asia. We have problems, and we have serious problems, but we need to start looking at solutions among ourselves. For me, that's very important. The world situation actually, I mean, rather than looking at the Indo-Pacific strategy, for me, it's China-US contention and the fact that the center of gravity of the world economy and of politics, geopolitics, is now next to us. That creates an opportunity which you can actually use for your own development, for your own. But how you do it, and you'll have to do it together, and you'll have to do it well. So that, I think, is something that is worth thinking about.
I'll come to specific countries now. Looking at Bhutan, is there a danger that Bhutan could go the Nepal way over a period of time?
I think they're far too clever.
Would you like to expound on that?
No, I think if you look at Bhutan, she has consistently changed and evolved depending on what she sees in the situation around her. She responded in one way to the Chinese occupation of Tibet. She responded in another way to the democratic upsurge in Nepal and became a constitutional monarchy on her own, made her changes. So at each stage, Bhutan has shown an awareness and an ability to think these issues through and to make the changes necessary so that she can maintain her own path. And she has a very strong sense of her own identity. She's been lucky. She's had, kings who could do this, who were capable of doing this. And the system has worked for Bhutan so far. So I don't see, Nepal has more basic issues about the political and social contract in Nepal, which, I mean, you don't have 3 constitutions in 20 years, if everything is settled and everybody is agreed. And so it seems to me that the Bhutan is not Nepal and will not go Nepal's way.
But Nepal itself seems to be learning its lessons by tangoing with China very closely over the last few years and seems to be stepping back a bit. Is that a reality in Nepal?
You know, every one of our neighbors will look for balancing arrangements vis-a-vis India. And China is the obvious balancer now. It used to be the US in the 60s and 70s. Today it's China. And as long as you show yourself willing to be, well, led by the nose or whatever, provoked or motivated by this competition with China, they'll use it to get the best they can out of you and out of China. And good luck to them. I mean, you do the same in their situation. What did you do with non-alignment? You did a similar form of balancing between the two superpowers. And in a sense, that's what they are doing between you and China. As long as your relations with China are the way they are today, are difficult and tense, they will use the opportunity. Now, whether they swing a little bit this way, a little bit that way, that's the stuff for PhD theses. But in the long run, what's basically happening, I think, is similar and is not changing very fundamentally.
Sri Lanka is a prime example of that case, where constantly swinging. No, don't bring the ship in. Okay, you can bring it after a week. Is Sri Lanka destined to live with this kind of swinging both ways, if I were to use that phrase?
I think if you talk to the Sri Lankans, for them, they know where they are located. They know where their primary interests lie. And they have consistently, all governments, whether it was the Rajapaksas, whether it's Ranil Wickremesinghe, whether it's back to Chandrika, to anybody, they've consistently said that they will respect India's security interests. It's a question of how we choose to define them, and defining them in ways that are compatible with their interests as well. And that's something that you have to work out with them. And I don't think that's difficult. I don't think that's an impossible task. But it does require a level of consistency, it requires very good communication, and it also requires no surprises. Today, Sri Lanka's condition, because of the debt crisis and so on, makes it difficult for Sri Lanka, and certainly for all of us who are dealing with this situation. But hopefully they'll be out of it soon.
Coming to Bangladesh, which seems to be such a major success story, but has it outlived its economic miracle, so to speak, economic and social miracle in some way? And has India made an error by putting too many eggs in just one basket? That is the Sheikh Hasina basket.
I don't know enough about the Bangladeshi economy, society, where it's going. But politics in Bangladesh, used to be a blood sport. I'm not sure where it's evolving. I think it's changing because there's a whole new generation. And so I'm very nervous of making predictions of where it will go. I would like to think that we have used this period to put in place mechanisms and whether it is power, whether it's on water, whether it's in terms of the transit and what Bangladesh earns out of it, or whether it's in terms of opening markets to each other. I think there are now interests on both sides which should sustain the relationship. Whether we've done enough or not, we'll only know when change comes in Bangladesh. And we'll have to see. But I do hope that we've used this to put enough stakes in the relationship which are in their interest as much as in ours.
And what about Afghanistan? Is it good enough for us to have that minimum level where any terror attack coming out of Afghanistan does not happen, to prevent those kind of terror attacks or early warning of any such things? Is that what we need to have with Afghanistan?
I think we should stop this Afghan bogey business. When was the last time you saw an Afghan terrorist in India? It's been never.
Actually, never.
Never. There was a time when the ISI outsourced training of their terrorists, Lashkar, etc., to the Taliban. Today, they have a troubled relationship among themselves. Pakistan is bombing the Taliban in or at least bases of the TTP bases and so on in Afghanistan. Watch the situation, deal with it. We've learned over time we are more successful in dealing with terrorism, and we know where it comes from. So I think this fear that we've used to justify various things of oh, Afghanistan chaos, it's going to lead to terrorism in India and so on. I think we need to keep our eye on the ball and watch what's actually happening on the ground. And let's see. I think we're doing the right thing by having people engaging, and we should be in there engaging with everybody and protecting our interests to the extent that we can. But we should also recognize that there are limits to our ability to influence events in Afghanistan. But we do, certainly we can play a defensive game, which I think we're doing.
And what about Pakistan? Does it even matter?
It matters. It matters because it can make trouble, but more important because I think we have an interest in Pakistan sorting its own issues out. And it has fundamental political issues. And today's situation is terrible when you say that 1/3 of the country is flooded, 1/5 of the population is displaced. I mean, this can lead to all kinds of consequences. So it's not in our interest that Pakistan goes down the tubes, not at all. In fact, for us, we actually, I think we should do whatever we can. Now, if they don't want help, they don't want help, but let the rest of the world help them to at least deal with this. There are different views in India. I don't think Pakistan is a major strategic issue for us, but it is a major factor in subcontinental policy, whether we like it or not. And we now seem to have come to a new sort of equilibrium with Pakistan, where it suits the domestic political interests on both sides to maintain this controlled and managed level of animosity, as it were. This seems stable. The ceasefire is holding for the time being. Let's see.
Yeah, the ceasefire may be holding because the Chinese are still in Ladakh.
Or because of the mess.
Because of their domestic mess, yeah. So coming to these specific countries outside of Pakistan, which of these countries is the biggest challenge for India? If I were to look at them as a challenge, not as a threat, and why would you think that?
For me, Myanmar is the biggest challenge. Because you saw what's happened in Mizoram across the border. You can see the potential uses that Myanmar could be put to by those who have hostile intent towards India. We have insurgent groups who can find bases there, can get arms, and as you see the situation in Myanmar deteriorate, it's not only, the restoration of democracy or those who are fighting the coup, but it's also all the armed ethnic insurgent groups and the kind of anarchy that creates and the situation that it creates for your security. And if you want to develop the Northeast, I think Myanmar becomes very important. And it's not an easy border to manage or control. So in various ways, I think Myanmar actually is a risk. It's your land route to Southeast Asia. And Pakistan's cut you off from Central Asia. You want to be cut off from Southeast Asia as well. It doesn't, it actually hurts you if the situation in Myanmar keeps deteriorating the way it has. And the reason it's a real challenge for me is because it's very hard to think of things that you can do about it. I mean, even ASEAN, you notice, has thrown their hands up. And that makes it the real challenge, is actually thinking, what can you do about this? How do you improve this disaster which everyone can see happening? And that's why I would rank it as the biggest challenge. Most other challenges, you can at least figure out a way forward. You have other people you can work with. You can do something. Here, it's very hard to say.
So in that sense, I'll come to my final question before I open it for the audience. Yeah. So is India reconciled to this new reality in the region?
Yeah, I'm not India.
I don't want to ask you, but in the sense, let me rephrase it. Are we going to live with a new reality where India is not the most dominant player in the region, where it's competing for influence with another player or other players?
Whether you like it or not, you are a predominant factor in everyone's calculus in South Asia. You have been, you will be, you are even now. So there is a sort of idea that somehow India's influence has declined. Actually, you have much more, today you have much more capacity. You have the ability to exercise influence in ways that you never did before. And where you have chosen to do it, as with Bangladesh in the last 15 years, it's actually worked well. But it's a question of how you imagine this relationship. This has never been exclusive. Neither the Indian Ocean nor the subcontinent have ever been exclusively an arena for you. During the Cold War, it wasn't. I mean, Pakistan was part of Cold War alliances, and you saw the role of communist parties throughout. Whether it's now, whether it's Chinese economic penetration or their interest in not just, in fact, in mediating internal conflicts in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, taking sides, in Myanmar, of course, with the armed insurgent groups as well. So I think to dream of some exclusive Indian sphere of influence, I think that doesn't make sense. It never has been, and I don't see it coming in the foreseeable future. So therefore, work with what you can. And as I said, you are the only, most major powers in the world, in fact, all of them are ready to work with you or defer to your inclinations in South Asia, except China. China is the only exception. Use this moment to build a South Asia which can actually work for all of us, not just for you, but for all of us, because you are the one who has a common interest with your neighbors to an extent that nobody else can match, and that nobody can beat you at. So rather than saying, I want preponderance, I want exclusivity, work on the common interest, and you'll achieve, frankly, much more than you do by saying, this is my sphere, you know, everybody else should stay out, and so on. That's impossible. They will balance you, and it's natural. And take that as the natural order of things and work with it.
Yeah, we've got half an hour for questions from the audience, questions, comments, anything. And I'll now open the floor to the audience.
Hi, thanks. That was a wonderful panel. I want to ask about the life and death of SAARC, or actually the death and afterlife of SAARC, maybe I should say. Should we be trying to revive it? And what do you think about South Asian minilateralism, as it were?
I believe in reincarnation, by the way. But I think, you know, you don't come back the same way. I think SAARC needs to be reworked. And I'm actually ambitious enough to think that we need to broaden SAARC's scope if it is to be relevant. If that's difficult at a moment of political crisis, then minilateralism, plurilateralism, whatever you want to call it, is the way to go. BBIN is a good example of what we've been doing on multimodal transport between Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal. We should do more of those kinds of things. On the maritime security side, for instance, what we've been doing with Sri Lanka, with the Maldives, now with Seychelles and Mauritius since 2011, those kinds of things. We need to be doing that in the Bay of Bengal, for instance. So there's a whole host of things that I think we can do, which I think would fall in your definition of minilateral. But yeah, that's the way to go.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Arpit from Hindu College, University of Delhi. So since the advent of pandemic, Indian state has kind of emerged as the savior for other countries, be it supplying vaccines to Vaccine Maitri or supplying grains to Ukraine, even when we are also buying crude oil from Russia at the same time. When in Pakistan, we are seeing people suffering because of the floods, Pakistan state tries to make Indian state bend down, try to facilitate the sources that India is trying to supply to the people of Pakistan by bending it towards through the United Nations. So, sir, at a point of time when Pakistan is trying to humiliate Indian state and Indian state is trying to fulfill its commitment towards the people of Pakistan, how does India does not make a compromise and yet fulfills its commitment which the people of India and Pakistan have been sharing, and be there and make them realize that even in times of catastrophe, Indian state would be there to help them out. Thank you so much.
You know, this is like asking, when did you stop beating your wife? You know, there's no good answer to this because you've made many assumptions there. You're assuming that the Pakistani state is trying to humiliate us. I mean, I'm not sure that the humiliation is, you're assuming that we are savior to the world. That, in any case, is not a very reliable emotion in international relations. How grateful are you to the US for having fed us from 1966 to 1969? Ship to mouth it might have been, but they did feed us, and PL 480 kept us alive before we could do the Green Revolution. Are you very grateful? I don't see much gratitude anywhere. And gratitude is not being savior, and projecting yourself as savior actually provokes the opposite reaction, where people say, what do you think you are? You did it for your own interest, and now you're demanding a price in terms of my loyalty and so on. So rather than looking at it in terms of, oh, gratitude or emotion or humiliation or any of these emotively laden words, I would look at it as, what's your interest in Pakistan? Is your interest in Pakistan collapsing? Is your interest in Pakistan getting worse? Or is it in your interest to have a stable, peaceful neighborhood, which Pakistan is a part of? And a Pakistan that's at peace with itself, because most of Pakistan's problems are not because of you or anybody else. They're internal to Pakistan. And surely, from our point of view, we need a peaceful periphery, where our neighbors are developing, are peaceful, are doing well. That's the best situation. It might be an ideal, maybe difficult to achieve, but that's what you should be working for, rather than worrying about humiliation or being a savior or being this or being that. So I would take the emotion out of it. And the less you bring into it, the less likely you are to have negative reactions from the neighbors.
Right, so thank you. I would like to ask, could you share a very successful example of Indian diplomacy that had prevented a major conflict, so such as Cuban Missile Crisis? And second one would be the future of UN. Is there any possibility that, apart from being a forum for just public discussion, there is a possibility that UN can actually fulfill a major role in hard power politics, especially when we are talking about our Indian neighbor policy? And that should be it. Thank you.
You know, most of diplomacy's successes are the dogs that didn't bark in the night. If you think of it, we fought 3-4 wars in the first 23 years of the Republic, 24 years of the Republic. We haven't fought a war since, not a major war. That's a success. And a lot of it is because you actually managed. So on the big questions, did you create an enabling environment for India's transformation? Did you keep the peace? Did you manage to keep the peace? When you didn't start off very well, you started from day one with a war on your hands, and a terrible geopolitical situation, actually. On the big questions, I think Indian diplomacy has actually delivered. So I would rate it overall in strategic terms as a success. Tactically, I mean, there's failures, there's successes, there's good things. I mean, as I mentioned, the relationship with Bangladesh, I think, is a success. I think, but there are also failures. I mean, if you look at the nature of our relationship today with Pakistan, with China, these are not great, successful, wonderful relationships. So, yes, there are things we failed at, there's things, but so tactically, I think there are many, many more examples. Can the UN do something good on the hard issues? You know, you're talking to the wrong person. I mean, I spent 7 years of my life in multilateral committee rooms. There are people in this room who spend longer. So I've been vaccinated. My faith is limited. No, but seriously, the UN can only be as effective. It's an organization of member states, right? It can only be as effective as the member states want it to be or make it. If the member states are quarreling, the UN is ineffective. And the member states have been quarreling for many years. And there's no sign that, in fact, their quarrels are getting worse when you look at the state of the world today. So my expectations of the UN are minimal. But I know perfectly good, sensible, rational, intelligent people who actually still hope for the UN.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. So how do you see the future of South Asia against the backdrop of growing deglobalization and increasingly countries becoming more insular, particularly post-COVID with supply chains getting localized? Thank you.
I'm not sure that we're actually deglobalizing except in certain strategic sectors where, and that would include high tech and in finance, strangely, where I think, for instance, the expropriation of Russian reserves has shocked people, or the use of SWIFT as a political weapon, I think has shocked people into thinking of alternatives, even though nobody has come up with an alternative, and there's no sign of anything nearby. But apart from sectoral sort of, if you look at even in high tech, where you know people have been, both China and the US have been trying to onshore now for many years, actually. But look at chips. Look at how difficult they found deglobalizing that industry. And that's not, you're not talking about a huge supply chain there. You're actually talking about a pretty concentrated industry. So for me, the trouble with words like deglobalizing, decoupling, and so on is there's no nuance in them. It suggests the whole world, everything is heading in one direction. I don't see that happening. If anything, you're seeing diversification to introduce resilience into supply chains. You know, there's China plus one strategy and so on. But China is going out. A lot of, somebody told me 85% of DFI into Vietnam and transfer of plant into Vietnam has been from China in the last 5 years. And we are now structurally tied to each other. Look at India, China. 2005, 6% of the value add in our exports was Chinese origin. By 2019, you're talking something like 40% of the value add in our exports, according to one figure that I saw. Whether the figure's right or not, but what I mean is that you are now structurally tied into each other, and India is not one of the most integrated economies in the global supply chain. So today, frankly, when people talk of balance, of at least the trade balance, or talk of the origin of goods as being Chinese or American, or frankly, I take that with a huge pinch of salt. The only things that I think are worth looking at are current account balance, because then you're looking at the larger things. But on the trade side, it's much harder to pinpoint where something has actually come from. Yes, these things, because the final product leaves India, it's classified as Indian in all the trade data. But, you know, if 40% of it is Chinese origin, another 20% is somewhere in Southeast Asia, I mean, then frankly, your data no longer reflects reality. And that reality is of a globalized world. And I don't see that unraveling so quickly in most sectors. But there are places, as I said, high-tech finance, which now appear strategic to more and more governments, where I think we will see the kinds of things that you're talking about.
You pointed out that China is an exception in more ways than one. So my question is, what is India's biggest fear about a rising China, or even, let's say, biggest fear about China in the next, say, 2 decades? And given that arguably, strategically, our strategic interests in the geoeconomic, geopolitical, and social are probably more aligned to China, with China, than almost any other major nation in the economy in the world.
I wish the Chinese believed that. We'll tell them. No, I'll tell you my greatest fear about China, actually, stems from the situation we're in today. China today, for the first time in history, is powerful but dependent on the world. This is something she's never been before in history. She depends on the world for food, for energy, for technology, I mean, you name it. She is tied into the rest of the world. She can't do what Chen Lung did to McCartney, to George III's ambassador, and say, I don't need you, go to hell, you know. But since you want to trade, you trade with those few fellows in Canton. She can't do that. And that, I think, is what. But for me, the big worry is a powerful but frustrated China, which doesn't achieve the China dream, which gets stuck in a middle-income trap, but has this huge PLA army, and where legitimacy now is based increasingly on nationalism. And that kind of China, how it will behave in the international system with neighbors, for me, is much more worrying than a China which still sees a future for itself, sees itself as a future number one, and therefore can say, I have patience for Taiwan. I can wait. Time is on my side. After all, if you believe as in historical materialism, then you can wait. History is going to do your work for you. But the problem will come when that is no longer the case. When a China that grows old before it gets rich. I mean, there's, you can string this together. And that's, for me, the biggest worry. Because then how she behaves will become... You've already seen signs of it. I mean, why do you see wolf warrior diplomacy today? And if you compare that with Chinese diplomacy, communist Chinese diplomacy in the 50s or in the 70s, 80s, it's quite different. And it's unnecessary, quite frankly. At least on a pure calculation of interest, rational calculation, it doesn't seem necessary. So that, for me, is a worry. From an Indian point of view, China is the only major power that actually opposes and is seen to be opposing India's rise. And that is, I think, the source of the fundamental tension between us. The rest of it, yes, these are, you will have trouble on the border, you have other kinds of trouble. We have made the trade imbalance into a big issue in our own minds. But Indian consumers are getting cheap goods, don't forget. But for me, that's the real source of the problem. And that's something that's much harder to address between the two.
Thank you, Sushant. So it's a bit related to the previous question. We often hear the phrase that India is a civilization, and we hear the same for China. The India bit more so after 2014, within a new sort of ideological framework. From a strictly foreign policy point of view, do you think India is a civilization? And can we argue then that the so-called sort of perennial war between India and China is a conflict of civilizational conflict, which we often hear? It's not a conflict of, it's not a political conflict, it's a civilizational conflict. This is one. Number two, somewhat related to this, do you think how India sees itself within South Asia? There has been a change before and after 2014. Is there a change in how India views itself within this regional context?
I can't speak for those who rule India after 2014. So I have no idea what's in their mind. Because if you look at the public record, you get all kinds of statements about the neighborhood and India's role. You get one sort of statement, most of it internally, which projects India as the leading power, as now setting the agenda, etc. But a lot of it, that is domestic propaganda. But externally, we seem to be still saying the same things to our neighbors. But what they watch is our actions. And if you look at the state of the relationship, with one or two exceptions, you have challenges in each of them today which you didn't have before 2014. So for your second question, I can't really give you a very clear answer. About is this a civilizational conflict with China? I don't know what a civilizational conflict is. History is no guide. It's true, yeah, Lucien Pai, I think, called China a civilization masquerading as a state, wasn't it? Obviously India is a civilization. I mean, you see an Indian, you know he's Indian. And I think the rest of the world recognizes the fact that there's such a thing as Indian civilization. We might doubt it, argue about it, but Chinese argue about China. I mean, Ko Chao Kuang writes a book, the most famous historian, saying, what is China? With a question mark. I'm not sure you can ask the same question in India without being accused of being anti-national. But, civilizations don't go to war. States go to war, kingdoms go to war, armies go to war. And I think that's the unit of analysis that you need to use in this case. So I'm not sure what we mean by a civilizational war. If it is, my civilization's better than yours, then go out and prove it and make it more attractive and see how many people are attracted to it. And maybe that's what you're doing when you get everybody to do yoga once a year. Maybe.
Thank you. Thank you for that very lucid and sort of temperate discussion. I just had a question, which was that, talking about the arcs of history, the arc of history in South Asia seems to bend towards, how should I say, a majoritarianism, to an ethnicized nationalism. There was a point where we used to congratulate ourselves that given the centrality and the largeness of India, that this wasn't a generalization that could be successfully made. But clearly, an unsympathetic outsider looking at South Asia would look at the travails of Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Myanmar and India and feel reasonably justified in saying that this is one of the largest things that defines this subcontinent or South Asia generally. So I suppose my question was that since so many South Asian states seem to see autonomy or sovereignty, in a sense, at least in one sense, as the license to go after their minorities without external interference, does this large fact, I mean, whether it's India or whether it's Myanmar or Sri Lanka, does this large fact, for you as someone whose life has been given over to diplomacy, does this throw any grit into the machine of diplomacy? I mean, do India's interests remain permanent across regimes that, shall we say, espouse pluralism in a kind of feeble way or espouse majoritarianism in an energetic way? Does this actually change the business of diplomacy?
It does. There's no question. But to go back to what you said earlier, we've really bought into this Westphalian state, right? And a 19th century conception of the Westphalian state, in a sense. And for me, the question is, a Westphalian state system, interstate system, almost inevitably seems to lead to interstate rivalry, to great power rivalry especially, and to this competition, the struggle for mastery, as it were. 400 years of war in Europe, 2 world wars, wiping out their power, etc. But does it also inevitably lead to the kind of majoritarianism that you're talking about? Or is this somehow unique to us in South Asia? Because it's a real problem, whether it's in Sri Lanka, where you're dealing with what the Sinhala majority was doing with the Tamils. When you say, is this grit in your... Yes, it is, because it prevents us from dealing with the big issues that we should be dealing with. I mean, that 26 years of civil war in Sri Lanka. You look at what happened in Nepal. You look at, the southern Bhutanese problem, for instance. I mean, it's across the board, this issue. And it does make diplomacy much more difficult. Because for me, the goal of diplomacy is to arrive at outcomes which work for all of you, right? It needs to. Your goal here is the well-being of your people, but that you can't do alone. You're part of this larger world. And how do you do that in a system? So because we really bought into the idea of a Westphalian state with fixed territory, monopoly of violence, hard boundaries, and many of us in South Asia were in the process of building this over the first 50, 60 years or so. I think we ended up with a lot of unnecessary trouble. But I'm not sure whether, to the second question, does it inevitably lead to majoritarianism? In our case, now in South Asia, I think globalization had a lot to do with it. Because and the ICT, Because once you start seeing what's happening in the rest of the world, and globalization brings, it becomes actually an attack on your culture, your identity. You know, what I said about vis-a-vis Nepalese when we say that, in essence, when the globalizing culture, when the Washington Consensus tells us, you're just like us, you're part of us, your identity, again, you've just been trying to build a Nepalese, Indian, Bangladeshi, whatever identity, and suddenly that's being wiped out with, thanks to ICT and your exposure to global culture. So identity politics, populism, majoritarianism, I think a lot of it is a reaction to those globalization decades. I think that's, for me, the immediate provocation. But it does make diplomacy much, much more difficult. And I actually think that, therefore, it makes diplomacy into a zero-sum game because of absolute sovereignty, and so I trace the original sin back there, actually, to the idea of the Westphalian state, which gave all diplomats a job, actually. So I shouldn't be biting the hand that feeds me, but I think but it's something that's really worth thinking about. You're the one who can answer this much better than I can, Mukul.
Can I pursue this fascinating dialectic of the constitution of diplomacy by the Westphalian state system and its subversion by the Westphalian state system in the form of integral nationalism a kind of a step further? Because on the one hand, you could think of that as a timeless problem that's been played out again and again in the crises of Europe. But maybe there's also a way of thinking of it as a contemporary problem of the present day. So if you combine, on the one hand, your very tactful remarks about India's current intersection between domestic party politics and diplomacy, on the one hand, with your comments about Wolf Warrior diplomacy in China, you could in fact see them as expressions of the same logic. In both cases, there is a internet media, social media driven politicization of the self-presentation of the state towards the outside. You could look at the same thing in Donald Trump's America, right? Who was also making shithole country remarks about, ran some indistinct vision of what Africa was. Bolsonaro, faking Chinese accents to appeal to his populist audience. So maybe we have to accept this not as just a particular problem of a particular region, but in fact a generic problem. Doesn't that really then pose the question of what the location of diplomacy is in future? Where does it go? I mean, granted, it performs an incredibly important function. Where are the spaces that we can think of diplomacy continuing to function in this world which is becoming wilder, and it's not going to get any less wild, I think. I think the hope of it getting less wild is really not helpful in the end. Particularly, I take your comments about America, I think they're absolutely spot on. People should not bet on America stabilizing in the long run. That's not its future. So is the answer, as it were, towards zones of technical diplomacy? I mean, is something like COP the place where this goes? In a sense, crucial, highly diplomatic, but so boring and so technical it just remains outside the realm of the public sphere? Or Europe, you could think of the EU as the ultimate zone of diplomacy, again, so technical and so demanding that no one can really follow it. Really only professionals could do it. A UN that actually did decide over the shape of bananas and things like that.
Thanks for cheering us up. No, I think, if you think of diplomats as negotiators, we're never going to run out of work. That's not the problem. I think the problem is, do states matter? Because right now we function because of this in the state system. But I think we have to get outside the state system now, because the real negotiations, as you said, COP, it's wonderful for diplomats, but it's irrelevant. For Pakistan with 1/3 of its country underwater, COP, it looks completely irrelevant. So I think that's the change that diplomacy will have to make. We'll have to get outside what we've been comfortable with and what we've got used to. We seem to agree on where we're heading, unfortunately. We seem to have the same ability to smile in the face of disaster, but it's not. But I don't see diplomats ever losing relevance. It's just that we'll have to negotiate differently in different fora and play a completely different sort of game, as it were. And we won't be only talking to diplomats the way we're comfortable doing. That's why we love COP, because we can talk to each other and we understand each other. But that is no longer the case. I think that's the big change.
Thank you. This question actually sort of follows on from the previous one, but at a different scale. You've mentioned the Pakistan floods have come up several times. We've talked about South Asia as a region, and you talked about how, you know, in some ways, what holds it together in terms of structured conversation and whether we have the institutions, SARC, and so on and so forth. And linking this back now to the climate question and looking at this moment in Pakistan, if you look at these 5 or 6 countries on any of these climate vulnerability maps, and you know the climaterati love these multicolored maps, it's glowing red, the whole region. So what is happening in Pakistan is highly likely, I mean the countries most likely to replicate this experience are this country, Bangladesh, Nepal in a different way, among the countries most likely to. Why is this shared vulnerability not being thought of or exploited as a way of kind of rebuilding a sort of a South Asian voice around future vulnerability in global arenas that engage with climate change? Why is this not becoming a political rallying cry? I mean, obviously there are some reasons that have to do with our energy politics versus our climate vulnerability index interests. But over time, as the vulnerability awareness grows, do you see this as a possible kind of rallying cry and a shared interest that gets acted upon?
Yeah, in fact, that's what I was trying to say, that it's time that we did this. And I don't understand. I don't have an answer to your question of why it hasn't happened so far. For me, it's obvious. It's something we should have been doing for some time. And I think we started a conversation, even within SARC, in 2005, 2006, among ourselves, and started saying we need to do something about water. I know the heads of government's retreat, they actually talked about it. 2004, I think it was, wasn't it, Sham? And 8. Yeah. And so it's not that there wasn't a willingness to look at this at the political level. So I have to assume that the problem is you're dealing with sectoral vested interests below that, and it's really the way we're constituted that prevents this from actually becoming policy or affecting the way we deal with each other. But that's why I hope the crisis at least shakes us into this, drives us in the direction that you're talking about. We have to hope.
Yamini, can I take 5 minutes? Can we overshoot by 5 minutes? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Quickly, the gentleman who's raising his hand. Yeah, the gentleman, yes. And I will just club all the questions together and quick answers. Please keep your questions short because we're running short of time.
So thank you, Sushant sir, for giving me this opportunity to speak these questions. So I am Abhishek. I'm an undergrad from political sciences from University of Delhi. And I have a few of the fundamental questions of the international politics that is taking the surface. My first and the foremost question is that in the contemporary era, we have witnessed that India has moved from NAM towards NAM 2.0, wherein it's aiming for a multilateral engagement with the whole world. So can we say in the contemporary context, NAM is irrelevant or it is gaining some other relevance? My second question is that as we have seen that the world has moved from collective security towards collective defense. And the foremost example of this would be Quad, which was initially being stated that it is an economic partnership. But now Ministry of External Affairs has widely been stated that it's a military partnership to counter China in the Indian Ocean region. So would that point out towards that UN is not having its relevance in the contemporary world? And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This gentleman. Yeah, keep your question short. Yeah.
Hello, Anshuman. I'm an undergrad student at University of Delhi, political science as well. But I come from the state of Assam, and the state of Assam recently gave a new department to its commerce industry, which is on the Act East policy. It's a department exclusively for that. And India is now building a trilateral highway between India, Myanmar, and Thailand. And my question is, since India has withdrawn from the RCEP and the IPF trade bloc, sir, do you still feel that these kinds of initiative and the way Act East policy that has been implemented in India, can they still tap onto these economies, and from their corridor they can be huge trade volumes for India, and how the relationship then changes with Bangladesh and Myanmar in that context? Thank you.
Yeah, the gentleman in the hat. Oh, yeah. We'll have to stop here. The gentleman in the cap. Yeah, yeah. Inko dijiye.
Thank you, sir. Sir, my name is Kartar Kapoor. I'm a student of comparative studies in the evolution of history, sir. It's a question of history. I see India as a shrinking state, that is, geography-wise, and state as a natural resources and land-wise. It is shrinking ever since history, dawn of history. We can move to the east, we can move to the west, we can move to the south. But when it comes to the north, everybody is pushing into Central Asia. China is pushing fast. West is coming, Russia is already there. But we have no access to the Central Asia. Now, China claims any part of land and takes it. Even from us it took it. We say, Aksai Chin is ours, Hunza is ours. And yes, I'm finishing. Kashmir is ours. But we can't take it.
We need a question.
Right, no, the question is, what's happening to us? What's wrong with this business nation?
That's the existential.
So we are shrinking and only shrinking. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we'll have to stop at this, and I'll let Ambassador Menon answer, and we'll have to close at this.
Well, quick answers. I don't know what's happening to us. I'm not an astrologer. I can't predict the future. Are we acting east? Yes, I think we're acting, but I think we're making it difficult for us to act east if we walk away from RCEP and the things that you mentioned. If you look at the economic environment in which we're acting, it's much less supportive and enabling than it was before. So, yes, we have real challenges, I think, in acting east. About the Quad is not a defensive alliance. I mean, there's no mutual security commitment in the Quad at all. And nowhere does it say that if one of us is attacked, we will go to the defense of everybody else in the Quad will come to their defense. I think the Quad is still finding, it still has a way to evolve, and we'll have to see what it becomes. Is NAM irrelevant? You know, I think, yeah, as a movement, the way it was conceived, it seems to be less relevant. But if you look at the Global South's reaction, say, to the Ukraine war and to Western sanctions on Russia, there is a clear thirst for another way, for a third way out there. It's just that nobody's offering one that sounds credible or likely to work. But there is an opportunity there, I think, to build larger coalitions and to work, because the Global South's issues are not being addressed by the current international system such as it is.
Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience, and Ambassador Menon, thank you so much for your views. It was wonderful talking to you.